We're talking about a pot across the military globally of $2.7 trillion a year, and the top 100 arms companies taking in revenue of over 600 billion. If you ask an arms industry what the answer to any problem is, well, the answer is going to be produce more arms, spending billions, potentially trillions in these areas, and the impact that has on so many other areas of life, leaving the coffers often relatively empty.
You know, they sort of work with media, for example, to insert violence effectively in things like film and television.
There are efforts being made to relax us, if you like, about weapon use, about weapon deployment, about what's often called the military-industrial complex.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Clark, International Editor of the BMJ. Conflicts are rising around the world, as are conversations in government about defense and military spending to ensure national security. Many of these conversations are having an impact on health. What's not being spoken about is the role of the arms industry. This is an industry worth $2.7 trillion in global military expenditures last year. How does this industry prioritize profit over health? And to what extent is the industry perpetuating conflict around the world instead of peace? I'm joined by Mark Bellis, professor at Liverpool John Moores University, who's also chair of the World Health Organization's Collaborating Center for Violence Prevention. He's co-authored a new series in the BMJ examining the arms industry as a commercial determinant of health. Let me ask you, other industries in health have been examined using a commercial determinants of health lens. Why is it that there's been less attention to the arms industry in health?
I think people start from the premise, if you like, that arms have to be harmful to health. And of course, weapons have, in many ways, specifically that purpose. What they don't really think about is that we can limit the harms. We can make decisions about how they're produced, what types of weapons are produced, how they're deployed, whether they pollute the environment, how much money they take away from health and other good causes. So we can affect the impact that the arms industry has on health by tackling all of these different issues. And if we don't do it, we really leave it to the arms industry to influence these things. And like any industry, what they're interested in is profit and not necessarily health and other beneficial outcomes. We're talking about a pot across the military globally of $2.7 trillion a year, and the top 100 arms companies taking in revenue of over 600 billion. So that's a lot of impetus, a lot of stimulus, if you like, for them to go out looking for the money. What we have to do is challenge that and make sure we go out and fight for health in that same context.
I really think that readers will appreciate that guns, weapons, and other arms have direct health impacts, particularly nowadays when conflict and wars are all around us. But they're going to be, I think, less familiar with the ways that the corporate practices of the industry itself are as important as the products that they develop and market and sell. So what are some of those practices?
It might do something called regulatory capture. So that's things like lobbying. People going out there spending millions of pounds to try and convince senior people in political positions and other public positions of authority to make decisions which benefit the industry, which pushes more money in their direction. They may attract people who have either been in positions of power in government or in the military, so that once they leave those positions, they start to come across and work for them. They know how to influence those systems. They know how to make the system work for them. And often those people will be put forward as spokespeople. So they'll appear regularly in the military, in the media, talking about the sorts of benefits of investing in more arms, talking up the threats from certain situations, all of which stokes investment, just as we can see now that's happening internationally in the arms industry, and puts money into their pockets. The importance is that we shine a light on those things, that we understand that from a medical and a scientific perspective, and that we get health, humanitarian and environmental voices into that conversation as well. So it's not all about people who industry want to be heard, talking about what supports their industry, but also other contexts as well, which are really important to healthy and safe lives.
Yes, there's a couple of pieces in your papers that I found extraordinary around that point of conflicts of interest, which you just mentioned. One of them is that there has been a tendency with this industry where there isn't declaration and transparency about conflicts of interest. What do you think are some of the reasons why we haven't examined this industry and its relationship to government and other decision makers as closely as we have the tobacco industry, the big food industry, even, I think, increasingly the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, these things are often hidden behind a view that this is security, that we can't talk about these things, that it's critical part of defence, and that's created, if you like, a curtain behind which some of these discussions, negotiations happen, and behind that we can find industry, we can find military, and we can find political voices, and it's very difficult sometimes to penetrate that from other perspectives like health, environmental and humanitarian. The problem is that the decisions being made behind those curtains have so many much greater repercussions for all those other areas. And of course, if you ask an arms industry what the answer to any problem is, well, the answer is going to be produce more arms. So the reality is that we need to get in behind that curtain and have those different perspectives and different consequences of spending billions, potentially trillions in these areas, and the impact that has on so many other areas of life, leaving the coffers often relatively empty and commitments to more and more money being spent on these things going forward for the next decade.
So in your view, what are some of the challenges for researchers who wish to take this commercial determinants of health lens on the industry, wants to interrogate further, wants to look behind that curtain? What are some of the challenges associated with gaining access, for example, to industry documents or policy dialogues or negotiations around international health treaties, etc.?
So it is difficult to get at the data behind some of these things. Actually, in many of the Western countries, at least some of it is available. There are many parts of the world where we know very little about the military-industrial complex and its relationship with the political settings. But there are ways that we can get at that information using new ways of accessing data. Much of the information is available in what companies may report, because many of them are making announcements about stocks and shares and other things. So some of the information is available there. We need to challenge, even before we start getting to the data, why some information is missing. Relatively little is reported on the environmental impact of the military and of weapons use. But that when we find information on that, we find it's quite substantial in terms of its impacts. So part of the research isn't even about getting to the data; it's exposing the fact that this data is hidden or not reported or underreported. And the truth is that it may happen that many of these things are discussed behind a security blanket. But we need to use research. We need to shine a light on some of these shadows so that we understand better what's going on and where there is a genuine case for national security and when it's just being used as an excuse to protect millions or billions of pounds flowing into particular industrial areas.
So what would you say to those opponents that said, listen, we do need to improve our security against threats, and the arms industry is absolutely essential to doing that?
So I think one of the most important things is this set of papers is not about saying we should leave ourselves defenceless. Far from it. It is important that countries, governments of countries, provide protection for their citizens, and that sometimes we work hand in hand. But people need to reflect on whether we are ever going to feel safe or safer if NATO spends more money on arms, if Russia spends more money on arms, if China spends more money on arms, if we exceed nearly the trillion spent on the military by the USA. What we're going to end up with is a place where we're even feeling more at risk. We have even more weapons of destruction. It's a greater threat to everybody. And in the future, and not far in the future, because this is already in some ways happening, not only will we have those more dangerous, more easily deployed weapons, but some of them will be autonomous. And really, we're not going to get to a period of peace by just increasing the arsenal of every single country in the world. Now, the reason we've ended up going down that line in part is because the advice that's being given is more weapons. More weapons is the answer.
Thank you. I agree, and it's brilliant to raise the issue of the arms race, if you will, this sort of clamor to do more to increase armament, because we're heading into a week where one of the world's largest arms fairs is going to be coming to London, the Defence and Security Equipment International Fair. This is a fair that attracts, an enormous number of delegations, both country and companies and other buyers, etc., but also a great deal of concern from campaigners, and we can be sure that there'll be protests and such on the streets in order to raise awareness to the public about the arms trade. Do you see your scientific work in this space as being available for the many, many people in our populations who wish for demilitarization?
People in different positions will take different things from these series. And there are arguments in there, as I've already said, to think about how much we are spending or how much we plan to spend on more new, more deadly weapons. And that's not just in this country, that's in many other countries. I hope what people take when they're thinking about things like arms fairs is to understand sometimes what's happening there. So these are opportunities for more lobbying. There are opportunities to recruit or potentially recruit people in positions of influence in the future. There are opportunities sometimes to present credentials which are about corporate responsibility, environmental responsibility, but avoiding the discussion of the harms that these weapons cause, or the development of these weapons cause, or the pollution around them, or the opportunity costs that we see because money is being spent on those and not in other key areas, which are also costing us lives in this country and on a global basis. So people can use this information however they like. But what I hope they do is they use it to understand some of the tactics which are being deployed in order to put profit potentially in front of things like national security and health. And if it's used in that way, hopefully we can come to a better place where the money is used more sensibly to provide a safer, more secure and healthier environment for everybody.
Mark, when I first contacted you to discuss the possibility of working with the BMJ on a series examining the arms industry as a commercial determinant of health, you agreed with me that this would be a novel contribution to the literature. And there's an enormous amount of depth and so many different examples within even the two main papers that you and your team led. And it struck me the importance of having that multidisciplinary perspective, but in particular the blend of the more critical social sciences with the health and medical expertise. Because in addition to all of the ways that we've discussed today about problematizing government policy or expenditure decisions that pit security against health, let's say, warfare versus welfare, as Cameron and I discuss in our editorial to introduce your series. But I was very struck by the examples that you and your team highlighted about the extent to which armament, the use of weapons, have infiltrated our cultures. And you describe examples where arms companies or lobbyists manage to, they sort of work with media, for example, to insert violence effectively in things like film and television.
Yeah, so as you say, as well as what's happening at the political level, there are efforts being made to relax us, if you like, about weapon use, about weapon deployment, about what's often called the military-industrial complex, how those things work together. And people may not know that there is relationships with entertainment, with film companies, about how these things are portrayed, agreements whereby equipment is used, but with a feed in, if you like, on how storylines develop and how things are portrayed within those, in major films. And then, of course, in gaming, we can see something similar as well, where representations of real weapons are used, often under agreement with manufacturers. And in the films, we can see a film where hundreds of people are killed. And that's become a part of entertainment, often for people of all ages. People can go and kill hundreds of people themselves, in an artificial environment in gaming. And these aren't accidental; they are controlled to a certain extent, anyway. And so that's one part of how public opinion, if you like, is influenced alongside what's happening at the political level.
Mark, I think there's a lot of material in your papers that will surprise our readers, including the extent to which arms companies are invested in universities or research institutes in this country, the UK, and beyond. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which that happens?
Well, we like to think that there are guardrails in universities. For instance, we have ethical boards in the vast majority of places which should be scrutinising research. Often, however, it depends on how funding is received. It depends on whether ethical approval is sought, and often ethical approval is something predominantly checked when people go for publication, and much of this work may not be aimed at open publication, certainly not open access, and maybe for the discrete use of a particular industry to develop a particular set of products. So there are some guardrails, but it's plausible to see how they may not necessarily be providing the sorts of protections we want. The scrutiny that we usually associate with academic rigor is also that of peer review, which should look at what's been done, why it's been done, whether it was appropriate. And again, that may or may not be present in some of these areas. And like I mentioned before, one of the problems at the moment is that what was a more discrete set of sciences around arms, in chemical, in physics, in other areas, has now started to creep into security, into artificial intelligence, into cyber, into what we'd see as space science. And so it becomes more difficult to understand the exact purposes for what things may be produced and how they're going to be deployed. Not only does that challenge universities in terms of understanding what's happening, that challenges us on a legislative basis as well, because the regulations that we put in place, the treaties that we put in place, often talk about weapons, but people can deploy these other things which may have other uses, and then they may be repurposed when they get to different countries, specifically for the purposes of warfare and conflict. So we're at a really changing point, and it's even more important that we get the science right. But we need independent science in our universities, and it needs to be challenging to the arms industry, not just supporting profit and weapons development.
So, Mark, if you were an academic or a medic affiliated with a university that was taking money from the arms industry, what is it that you could do to confront and, lobby against that?
Well, I think the thing to ask is what's being undertaken. Is it transparent? Is it ethical? What we don't want is we don't want less science. We don't want less medical understanding of these things. We want more, but it has to be transparent. It has to be independent, and it has to be balanced. And those are the sorts of questions we should be asking. It's easy to turn around and say, well, let's not do arms-related research, but that's not exactly what we're saying here. We're saying is let's understand the full picture, let's understand the potential consequences, and let's make sure what we're doing is available for scrutiny and peer review. If you find those things aren't going on, that should start to ring alarm bells. On the other hand, if you're involved in seeing research which is looking at some of the health consequences, some of the political problems that might come out of some of these weapons or these sort of deployments, absolutely make sure that information is available to colleagues and make sure they're in a position to utilise that in the advocacy they need to do to challenge some of the decisions which are being made at the moment.
On the point about regulation and back to the point about guardrails, I think a general reader, including myself, would have assumed that these international treaties and international humanitarian law would provide to a certain extent a guardrail against some of the harms associated with the arm industry and would be protective of health, particularly civilian health. But one of the things I was struck with in your papers is that even though I counted at least 10 international treaties that are meant to, effectively enforce humanitarian law, but also ensure that arms sales don't flow from companies or nations to buyers that may be at risk of committing war crimes or otherwise compromising international humanitarian law. And yet, even those guardrails negotiated at the international level appear to be far, far from fail-safe. Can you talk a bit about the limits of those international treaties, which I think will surprise many of our readers, including the fact that many of the countries haven't even actually signed them, including the UK, Canada, America, etc.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first part is that we have a lot of treaties which are supposed to protect particularly civilians in areas where there may be conflict. They're supposed to control the levels of arms trade. They're supposed to keep arms trade away from areas where there may be humanitarian issues and human rights problems. However, the wording can often be altered in ways which could be seen as favourable to maintaining arms trade. And we need to remember practically that some of the biggest players in setting up these treaties are nations which are some of the biggest arms traders as well. And within those, there are relationships with the industry. And so we can see how treaties may be relaxed in order to allow trade to happen on a broader basis. In some cases, and you can see this in the things we've written, we can see where treaties may be ignored. And as you said, again, not even some of the major countries have signed up to some of the main treaties and regulations which are there to stop some of the worst atrocities that can happen because of the deployment, the sales, and the use of arms in different places. So Unfortunately, while we should be able to rely on these to be established with exactly the right reasons and independent from industry pressures, that unfortunately doesn't always seem to be the case. And again, it's something we need to look at if we're going to ensure that that arms are deployed and developed only where absolutely essential, and not for the reasons of increasing the flows of money into countries and into industries.
Well, I'm hopeful that the BMJ series on the arms industry and health will help shine more light on that and inspire more scrutiny. Mark, what do you hope will be achieved by the publication of this series this week?
I hope we see more people from health with partners in other areas coming forward to challenge some of the discussions we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, put forward or think about alternatives to thinking that just more weapons, bigger weapons are the answers to the problems, the really sticky, difficult problems we're facing at the moment. The truth is that the answer is not to find ourselves in 5 or 10 years' time staring down the barrel of an ever bigger gun and hoping that is going to solve things like international conflict. If anything, if that's what we're doing, we're going to make things worse. And that's why we need health, humanitarian, environmental voices. And I think health possibly might be one of the few sectors that is big enough to stand up and question some of the things that are being done on the conflict and the arms industry side of things. So we've seen that sort of thing happen in the past with some success, where medics, other people have come together and challenged things in nuclear, challenged things in cluster munitions, challenged the terrible and long-lasting harms we see from things like mines. But we need more of that, and we need more science around that, because this is becoming a more complex issue with different technologies involved. And so I hope this series stimulates people, particularly in health, to be at the centre of those alternatives to some of the things we're seeing at the moment. And from that, I really hope we come up with different solutions than investing in more and more weapons.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for joining the BMJ podcast. That was fantastic.